Hello, I'm Molly Presley, and welcome to this week's edition of Data Unchained, a podcast about making your data available as a global resource when and where you need it. This week, I'm super excited to be joined by an interesting leader in not just the technology community, but also in the visual effects and animation community. Hailing from over in London, we have Jeremy Smith, the CTO of Jellyfish Pictures. Jeremy, thank you so much for joining us.
Hey, Molly, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
It's kind of fun to get to talk to you live instead of over a Teams chat. So this is a nice opportunity to connect. Tell me just a little bit, and our audience a little bit about yourself professionally, personally. Give us a little color to who Jeremy is.
My name is Jeremy. I've been working in the media space for many, many years. I've moved to the UK probably about 15 years ago and just have worked for Jellyfish Pictures on a range of different projects. And about me personally, I've always been interested in technology and cameras, very, very from a young age. And so I'm in the unique position where I can kind of get to combine the two worlds. So I feel very privileged.
I found it interesting. You and I have talked many times for many reasons, but whenever we talk and you talk about kind of the merging of HPC technologies and visual effects, that's a really interesting background. We think of visual effects as mostly being artists and creative types, and supercomputing is such hard science, but you have great experience in both.
What a lot of people don't realize about this industry is that there is like a lot of massive amounts of compute that are required, and there is a lot of similarities between this industry and HPC. So when it comes to basically kind of like doing what we call a bunch of CGI rendering or simulation or any sort of like stuff like that, there is a huge amount of similarity between working on a solution to battle COVID or for figuring out vaccines or weather forecasting. So both different areas just require a huge amount of compute, especially in the media and entertainment space where the quality bar is getting higher and higher. The amount of resources keeps increasing. So there's definitely like a lot of crossover and a lot of similarities.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's kind of interesting that I've seen, the compute and rendering jobs of a VFX environment hit, not just thousands, but tens of thousands of cores when you really need to get work done. And like you say, it's kind of classic HPC type of work.
A while ago, I think we bursted or peaked for about 90,000 cores, for the rendering for basically a feature animation that we did. And so that wasn't even Ultra HD at the time. So again, as the quality demands gets higher and higher, we are seeing like a lot more reason for HPC or high compute workloads in this industry.
So tell us a little bit about Jellyfish Pictures.
Yeah, Jellyfish Pictures has been around, since the early 2000s. And Jellyfish specializes in animation and visual effects. So we do everything from like looking and, creating the artistic storyboards all the way up to basically final frame delivering out of compositing. So we also do things like animation, compositing, things like character rigging, all the way through the entire workflow processing in creating content. And we've, over the years, we've had the privilege of working for quite a few different projects. Some of them small, some of them big. Some of the bigger ones are things like Star Wars, Rogue One, a lot of this, content you see on Disney Plus. And we've also, the feature animation I was talking about was for DreamWorks Animation, and a lot of live action stuff for Netflix. And we're actually just finishing up Stranger Things 4. So we've had the privilege of working on quite a few different projects over the years.
That's pretty cool. Jellyfish Pictures may not be a household name, but certainly the content you're working on is. And it's kind of fun to get to see behind the scenes how they produce all of that content.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a lot of work that goes on behind the curtain to make these shows. But we're just happy to be a part of it.
So your company has been growing really quickly over the last, 5-10 years, adding lots of artists, adding lots of capabilities to handle the demand from these feature films. Can you talk just a little bit about what that growth trajectory has looked like and maybe some of the challenges that you've bumped into in fill, like filling the growth demands?
The growth demands is also being led by the demand for like content and in television. When I started in this industry quite a while ago, there were no streaming services. Everything was based on linear TV, and so.
That's hard to imagine nowadays, isn't it? It's hard to remember that world. It wasn't that long ago.
But say, for example, I mean, if a show was on, like, say, Thursday night at 7 o'clock, and if you're 15 minutes late, basically there was no way you can't just go back and watch that again, if you see what I mean. You have to record it or wait for it to air again. But now, there's been a lot of streaming services, coming on the market. So I think it was just this week or last week, Paramount Plus is actually officially launched in the UK. Netflix have kind of changed the game as to basically how and where people consume content. So, instead of basically having to like watch it on TV at a certain thing, you could watch it from any smart device, really. So I think the demand for high quality content is skyrocketed, and plus you still have your standard, let's call them distribution channels, like traditional broadcast for content on there. So there's a lot of new shows being commissioned and all the rest of it. It is really exciting. So I think we're also seeing, that on top of everything else, and with that, that's helping fuel the growth in this industry.
What kind of challenges have you bumped into? Have they been mostly, technology? Is it finding humans to do the work? Where do you find that growing and when all this demand is surging has been the most biggest challenge?
I think there's been several challenges over the years. One was related to technology and just making sure that as we scale, that we can basically kind of go and scale out with it. The other is basically just making sure that we have access to the right talent of people, regardless of where they're based, and just making sure that people have a good, work work quality of lifestyle. And I think, yeah, so those are the two biggest challenges. But we recently see like technology becoming an enabler rather than a barrier. So that's actually really, really exciting to see. And the way that things were done, like say 10, 15, or even 5 years ago, is completely transformed. And a lot of that is basically, from a technology perspective, based on cloud-based technology. So as I was saying earlier, like cloud or cloud distribution like the Netflix, the Paramount, the Amazon Primes, and sort of stuff like that. It's really kind of changed the way people consume content, but we're now seeing a change on how cloud-based technologies are actually fundamentally changing the way that content is created as well. So I think that's really, really exciting.
So you use cloud, of course, for providing the content to all of us. But can you talk a little bit more about the types of technologies you use, whether it's from, I know you use some cloud rendering, but maybe talk a little bit about the cloud technologies that you've taken advantage of?
8 or 9 years ago, we kind of wanted to really take a look at cloud-based solutions that would kind of help us from a staffing perspective, or just helping us make sure that we're not making the right decisions from a like say leasing buildings and offices perspective. So quite a while ago, we started partnering with a company called a well-known company now called Teradici. So for everyone watching this podcast, I'm sure that is a household name now, especially after the pandemic. And Teradici, or PC over IP, is essentially a pixel streaming services that allows you to stream the contents of a high performance workstation to almost anywhere. The real bottleneck is actually really down to things like just network provisioning. So we started using that about several years ago, like 9 years ago is what I was saying. And one of the main reasons for that is because basically based in central London, it's actually very, very hard to actually find a physical premises at the time where you could actually house all of your team under one house. And so we, took a look. We basically set up another physical office for, the let's call them the overspill staff that we needed, because our main office wasn't big enough. But yet, we didn't want to provision more servers, more switches, and more backups, more UPSs, and all that sort of stuff. And so we really kind of put our heads together because we want to work, smarter and not harder. And Teradici was a very, very key part of that. Everyone is a lot of people in this industry are now using them, and it's kind of opened the doors to basically kind of what is now possible compared to even a few years what wasn't.
So you were solving the remote workforce challenge in a lot of ways, even before COVID. This was something you were needing to tackle before the mass move to remote workers.
Absolutely. COVID has basically just been a massive accelerant for this line of thinking, and even for the maturity of the of different products themselves. Someone quoted a while ago saying that we've seen about 10 years of development into these sort of technologies over the past 24 months. So there's been a massive, investment and uptake into these technologies. So yes.
So you were in the M&E industry, they call it virtual studios, kind of the idea of being able to work remotely from your studio environment, whether that's in London, Hollywood, wherever it might be. What gaps did you see in that first deployment of virtual studios that still made things difficult or cumbersome to really accomplish that vision of really enabling remote workers and remote cloud services?
We turned back the clock several years. The connectivity was an issue because bandwidth base wasn't as widely as available as what it is now. Even in some other areas, it's still not as accessible as what I would like to see it. However,
Everybody doesn't have 5G yet
no,
by
no,
any
not
means.
that's right. That's right. But basically, but it has improved, and more importantly, the cost is actually falling through the floor for that sort of connectivity. The other one is that, commodity hardware wasn't quite fast enough to kind of keep up with certain tasks. So say, for example, in some scenarios, you had to have custom silicon from the manufacturers, and that basically had a limitation of where you could deploy it, where you could rack it, where you could stack it, and all that sort of stuff. But, fast forward the clock to today, if you take a look at the average processors from Intel, AMD, and all the GPUs from AMD and NVIDIA as well, we're now seeing that the standard processors and standard graphics cards are actually outstripping their bespoke hardware counterparts. And so really it's kind of, the whole thing has kind of moved over to a software stack rather than having to deal with kind of bespoke hardware. And that does really open up a lot of interesting opportunities from like a deployment and maintenance perspective, and everything else. So I mean, before the pandemic, we saw some of this, but it's really taken off over the past 2 years. And so the quality bar, the efficiencies that we see, it's really incredible.
When you think about some of the challenges going on that are kind of front of mind today with supply chain issues, does that affect Jellyfish much at all?
Absolutely. I mean, that's affecting us today. So say, for example, I mean, if we want to order X amount of servers or storage or whatever, the lead times are through the roof. And so we've had to use like a lot more public cloud-based resources simply because, you can't get stuff. Like even getting a laptop for some manufacturers is crazy. And we have also had orders canceled on us. So the ability to operate in a hybrid mode has been tremendously beneficial because you can help mitigate, the supply chain issues or the not certain kit being available or that sort of stuff. So obviously we have our own data center, but we completely augment that with the public cloud. So I mean, Jellyfish use a lot of Azure. We use both on a regular basis.
When you talk about using the cloud and where you have data centers and where you don't, I'm not asking you to call it specifically where you're set up, but are you working outside of London? Are you multinational?
When we worked on a project several years ago, I think we hired people from over 20 different countries. So this was in the UK. There's the whole COVID thing. So there's a lot of Europeans who worked in the UK and they wanted to go home to be with their families, and which is totally understandable. The other implication that we had was Brexit. So again, that threw kind of another spanner in the works, as they say, to try and get around that. So no, yeah. So we are international.
And I imagine that cloud technologies helps you fulfill that you can potentially find a POP or a cloud region locally if you need to, or supplement with data center. It gives you some flexibility.
Absolutely. Yes. Yeah, definitely.
You've recently been deploying Hammerspace to kind of supplement the strategies and this trajectory you're on. What problem did Hammerspace solve that the other technologies we've already talked about didn't quite fill the gap on?
First and foremost, we found like the engineering team at Hammerspace to be top notch. They really kind of engaged with us. They kind of like understood the exact problem that we were having, and they really did roll up their sleeves and really get stuck in. The data that Jellyfish use and many other people in this industry, it would be classified as unstructured data. And it's very hard for us to kind of keep the key dependencies between all of that unstructured data. There are several what are called ASM systems or asset management systems out there, but some are more rigid than others. And Hammerspace, it helps basically kind of abstract that. So say, for example, the fact that it is a global file system more easily lets us kind of like pre-hydrate or move data from point A to point B. And then obviously users or other tasks in those other areas could also benefit from that. The other challenge that we had is not just users, but as I'm sure you've seen on the news, the cost of electricity and gas, in the UK is actually skyrocketing. And so as I said before, this is an industry that requires massive amounts of compute, and that takes a lot of electricity, that takes a lot of power. And so when taking a look at things like running costs, we also kind of want a way of working smarter and not harder. And so we're actually, if you kind of like take a look at different workflows or different costs of power and electricity cooling kind of around the globe, you can actually kind of like do your main heavy lifting in other cheaper, more cost-effective areas rather than like paying a lot of money just to kind of keep the kit cool for the same amount of compute. So if you take a look at like your TCO over like say 3 or 5 year period, the cost of the hardware is actually only one component of actually the running costs, basically while you actually use that. Things like power and cooling, I think people are going to pay a lot more attention to that as the years go on.
How does Hammerspace help you with that part of the problem, the moving content to different rendering farms?
Hammerspace kind of helps by orchestrating the data from getting the data from A to B. Historically, in this industry, if you had like a solution that was not software defined, you would literally have to, use a transfer mechanism to basically feed over that data from point A to point B, and then maybe even a human or some other, you know, intelligent way of actually kind of like repathing all that data and kind of orchestrating that. With Hammerspace, that literally does go away. And so the ability to help basically move the same data structures from point A to point B does make things a lot easier for us. And also the fact that Hammerspace, obviously you can deploy it on a VM, you can deploy it in the cloud, you can deploy it in a data center, you can deploy it, you can deploy it on-prem. So it doesn't really matter. It gives you like a lot of flexibility, a lot of granularity. If you look at some of the other, the more traditional storage appliances that have been very dominant in this industry and many other industries, you don't have that level of flexibility. It's which limits to where you can deploy, which limits to basically what you can do. By having the data, accessible in those different areas does make things very interesting.
So we kind of covered data moving around to many places, whether it's remote artists or different cloud regions for compute, whatever it might be. How do you handle security? Is that a top of mind concern for you?
Believe me, there's a lot of audits in this industry just to kind of make sure that the IP is actually protected. What we've seen certainly over the past 2 years, is a lot more audits kind of catering towards cloud-based workflows and cloud-based deployments. But essentially, we've been through like a lot of different audits and we haven't had an issue. But obviously, like your system architecture does need to be set up in the correct way. But we haven't had an issue with that when using Hammerspace. What I was saying before is that some of the pixel streaming services like Teradici, they offer actually a tremendous added value without even trying, because what happens is that, say for example, I mean, if I log on to a virtual workstation, I'm streaming the pixels. I actually don't have that content. So say for example, I mean, if you're taking a look at it like at an endpoint device, and if you secure that endpoint device properly, I mean, they can't actually have access to that physical file, which is very impressive.
I think that's part of what some people have a hard time getting their heads around of you're working with very large content, large files, large sets of data, and you aren't moving that data to every artist in your that's in their remote locations. But like you say, they're just working with the pixels and the data sits somewhere else. Can you maybe go a little more deeply into that? Because I think that's something that people think about David gravity or the laws of kind of the physics of data, and they think about how on earth could you move this much content around?
When it comes to the endpoint device, I mean, we're simply streaming pixels. That's exactly what we're doing. And so, from that workstation, which is could be a virtual machine, it could be running on the cloud or in a data center or wherever, the actual end user, that's what they're connecting to, that's what they're doing. When it comes to basically kind of like what Hammerspace does and basically kind of the orchestrate data from A to B, that is a lot of data. But obviously what you can do, you can like target certain subsets of that data that's to be used. So you don't have to basically kind of like take everything, but you can be very clever with the way that you kind of pre-stage and pre-hydrate, certain types of data. So, I mean, if we kind of like really, and and you're in control of that. You're in control of that, and really the limitation to like how much data you can move is how fast is your connectivity, what sort of like network topologies do you have, and so forth. So
It's a different way of accessing data through metadata, through subsets of kind of objective based data access. And it's just a different way of thinking about things than we historically did when you're sitting right next to your storage system and would work directly with the data.
yeah, that's correct. So say for instance, traditionally you'd have two separated filers. It could be from vendor A and the other one could be for vendor B, but they had nothing to do with each other. And you would simply copy or move or transfer data from point A to point B. But that would be as intelligent as it kind of gets. Now we're seeing that, hey, the filer is actually one filer. And then it's the
No
different.
matter if it's sitting in the cloud or vendor A and
Exactly.
B or whatever it is. It
Exactly.
makes perfect sense.
That's right. And so at that point, because it's, that data is under, let's call it under data management, then basically have policies and drive it and get it to do A, B, or C, depending on exactly on what your needs are.
I think as we start to tie up this episode, a few things I want to ask you. You have deployed a lot of interesting forward-looking technologies fairly early. Where do you do research? Where, if you're talking to, peers of yours who are thinking, where do I, maybe find technologies? Where would you point them to?
Probably looking at the requirements and just keeping abreast of changes in the technology space in general. So, say for example, I mean, if you take a look, everyone uses this example, but I'll use it as well. Everyone takes a look at things like 5G and sees like where this is the benefits that 5G brings, and these are the best use cases to where it could be used. And then I suppose I start thinking and maybe speaking to a few other people, hey, how can we basically how can we use 5G to better this industry or to better our workflow? So that sort of thing. Like I'll give you an example. If you're basically on a shooting for a Hollywood movie on set, you instead of basically kind of like shipping hard drives, uploading plates or rushes from that day, you could theoretically upload them over a 5G SIM. That means that it kind of gets to our digital artists faster, and they can start taking a look at the plates, sooner than later, which helps speed up the creative process. And so I suppose it's just keeping abreast of different technology spaces, working with like different cloud CSPs, and vendors, and vendors like Hammerspace, just to see on what the implied changes would be.
Do you find that the cloud vendors help introduce you to the correct technologies to consider? Are they kind of part of your brainstorming crew?
Yeah, so say for example, I mean, we normally touch base with them to see what products they have coming to the table, what changes we are. But one of the things that's really really powerful is the collaboration that we work with them. We find that a lot of the hardware and software vendors, they're very keen to work with us, or very keen to work with them. And so that's something that I think is very, very good. So it's not just basically what's down the roadmap, but obviously, we can say, hey, it'd be great if your product did X, Y, or Z. And then we show them why. And then more often than not, it ends up on a product roadmap.
Right, right. It's definitely not just a one way, here's what you can buy, take it or leave it kind of conversation.
Exactly. And then we would kind of go through and measure up and say, hey, one plus one actually equals three in this scenario. And I think that's where things can get exciting.
Where do you see the industry going next? Is there any kind of clear next steps, or are we already trying to sort out the what's next with the remote workforce and distributed environments that we're dealing with
I
today?
think the implications could be quite large, and I think this industry and many other industries are just trying to see and I say in air quotes, like what the new world kind of like looks like kind of going forward. So I think COVID has been a massive accelerant, and I think I really do think kind of like the face of how content is going to be made will certainly look different from the past 5 or 10 years. I think we're going to probably see more distributed like compute rather than everything like living in the basement. You will probably see more adoption of cloud-based technologies, public cloud or private cloud or whatever that may look like, kind of going forward. Then after that, we'll see what happens. But that's probably where like a lot of people are today, really.
Jeremy, thank you so much for joining the show today. I know you have a busy schedule. You're dealing with perhaps a transportation issue with train strikes in London going on today. So thank you for taking some time out of your day and joining us.
No, it's my pleasure. It's been great. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to Data Unchained, powered by Hammerspace. To learn more, visit hammerspace.com. If you have a guest you would like to hear on the show, email me at molly@hammerspace.com.